Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the New York Public Library, to those of you here with us in the Burger Forum and those of you who are joining us virtually. My name is Martha Hodes. I'm serving as interim director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Just before we begin, it's clear that this event is being recorded, just so that you know. And if you don't have a mask and would like one, just signal and we'll try to find you one. Thank you. Well, this evening, we close out our springtime series of conversations from the Cullman Center with a wonderful program. Cullman Fellow Ava Chin will be talking about her new book, Mott Street, A Chinese American Family's Story of Exclusion and Homecoming, in conversation with Harvard professor and Cullman Fellow Maya Jasanoff. If you have an NYPL library card, or if you live in New York State and want to apply for one, you can borrow Mott Street for free. You can also buy the book at the library shop, and the proceeds benefit the library. You can find links to buy the book on the event page at nypl.org/conversations. And best of all, you can buy the book here and have it signed by Ava right after the program, just outside the Burger Forum. Allow me just a moment to say a few words about the Cullman Center. We select 15 fellows each year who come to the library to gain intensive access to our unparalleled collections in order to write the books of tomorrow. Our fellows are among the best and most promising: academics and independent scholars, fiction writers and poets, journalists, translators, playwrights, and artists at work today. Writers and scholars from any country are welcome to apply, and the next application cycle will be available on our website in June. If you're coming in, please feel free to find a seat. There are seats here and there, and don't worry about shuffling. We're happy to have you with us. Thank you. You can also see everything the library has to offer by signing up for our newsletter at nypl.org/connect. All programs are made possible through the generosity of patrons like you, so please consider supporting the library however you can, especially at this moment of the city's proposed budget cuts. Indeed, I beg of you to visit nypl.org and follow the links to our campaign page, where it will take less than a minute to sign a letter to City Hall, and I thank you in advance for doing that so very much. And now, my friends, to tonight's program. Our speakers will converse for 35 or 40 minutes, then take your questions. For those of you here with us, you can use the card and pencil on the chairs to write your question, and program staff will come around shortly before Q&A to collect them. If you are joining us online, please share your question either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. Please be sure to do that during the program. Once Q&A begins, we won't be able to monitor the questions online. And now I have the pleasure of introducing this evening's guests. Ava's interlocutor, Maya Jasanoff, is professor of history at Harvard and the author of The Dawn Watch, which was a New York Times Best Book of the Year, Liberty's Exiles, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Edge of Empire, a Book of the Year selection from The Guardian and the London Sunday Times. Maya's writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, and The Guardian. She is a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, and she was a Cullman Center Fellow in 2006-2007. Maya converses this evening with Ava Chin, the author also of Eating Wildly, Foraging for Life, Love, and the Perfect Meal, which won the International MFK Fisher Book Prize. And she's also the editor of the anthology Split, Stories from a Generation Raised on Divorce. Ava teaches creative nonfiction at the City University of New York, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times. I'm sure many of you remember her Urban Forager column, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Village Voice, and Sever. The Huffington Post named Ava one of 9 contemporary authors you should be reading. Ava wrote Mott Street as the Gene Strauss Fellow at the Cullman Center in 2017-2018. The New York Times has called Mott Street a sensitive and ambitious story, one told with pageantry, an expansive family history encompassing perilous journeys, sensational crimes, and social change. The Los Angeles Review of Books finds that Ava writes with the tenacity of a historian and the fine brush of an accomplished artist, producing a sweeping memoir. The Publishers Weekly starred review put it this way: deeply researched and superbly told, readers will be rapt. I am already rapt, and I can't wait to hear more, so please join me in a very warm welcome for Maya Jasanoff and Ava Chen.
Thank you, Martha, for that introduction. Thanks to the New York Public Library for everything it does to support cultural life in this city. And thank you especially to the Cullman Center, through which really you and I met, among other things, despite across a decades of difference. And it's a testament to the power of community of the Cullman Center that I, as an ex-fellow, came sort of ambling along one day a decade later and met someone who was then a current fellow, Ava, who was working on this fabulous book. And the minute that I heard about it, I knew that I wanted to hear more. So I thought I'd kick off our conversation tonight, Ava, by asking you to share with the audience a little bit about how you found your way into this story.
Sure. So I just want to say also how very much it feels like being home in this room with so many of you. Many of you I know from different walks of life. Some of you I have yet to know, but we will get to know each other. And also, I'm really thrilled to be here with you, Maya. The very first time I saw Maya interviewing somebody here in this very room, I was so impressed with her that I completely forgot about everything else and why we were there, because I was just so busy listening to the sound of her voice. So it is really, really thrilling to be here. And to answer your question, there were many ways into this story, but growing up, I had so many questions that remained unanswered in our family that slowly started to unravel as I started to ask more and more questions. And so I'm just going to read to you a section from the book. It's an early section of the book where I talk about, some of the things that I do in this book would be anathema to my Lutheran grandmother, who was born and raised on Mott Street, a real true lighter, right? She would not have liked me to air the dirty laundry, as I have been doing. But Grandma, who is now no longer with us, I have conversations with her in my head about how important this story is, that this story is actually much larger than any single individual. This story is a story that really talks about our communities in America. As a writer, I believe it is important to uncover the truths from our collective past, no matter how painful or unsettling the discoveries. And so much of Chinese exclusion has felt personal. As I tried to piece the puzzle together, I was forced time and time again to contend with my own feelings of exclusion, even from within my own family. No matter how old I was, a 20-something writer seeking my father out for the first time, or a professor mom to a sixth-generation Chinese-American New Yorker. No matter how many times I tried to understand and interview my father, I always found myself here, alone, engaging in a solitary dance with the shadowy specter of having been excluded from my chin side for so very long. It wasn't the only erasure that I felt. Growing up, my maternal grandfather, Gene, a gourmand who loved to cook up wonderful meals for the family, who regaled me with stories of our ancestors on his side, stories about working on the nation's first transcontinental railroad out west, held me in thrall throughout my childhood, well into my school years. In the 6th grade, when my teacher began the lesson on the nation's first transcontinental railroad, I thought that I already knew everything there was to know about it. But when I opened up my big textbook on American history, I stared in disbelief at the official photograph. Where were we? What was this nonsense? To understand what really happened, I needed to collect as many of our stories as possible. As a college student, I started interviewing my family members and made my way out to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints genealogy library in Salt Lake City to look for traces of my railroad worker ancestor. Decades later, I continued the journey as a professor, zigzagging my way across the country to consult archives and experts and visit my family's many places of detention, the border towns where they crossed over, and their sites of greatest achievement. I even moved my family across the globe as a Fulbright scholar to visit the villages in China that we had left behind. We are a Toisan family, so I went out to at least 3 of our villages. Eventually, I uncovered the Chinese Exclusion Act files on each of my major family members, manila files filled with intrigue, half-truths, and in some cases, outright lies. It is a general rule of thumb amongst researchers and historians alike that it is the written record that is the gold standard, and the family stories that are long on twisted falsehoods, embellishments, and tall tales. But when you're Chinese in America with roots that go all the way back to the exclusion period, it is the historic record that is the fabulous fabrication, and the oral histories passed down from generation to generation like rare, evolving heirlooms that hold the keys to the truth.
As the readers will learn, but as the audience has just heard, your family in America has been here for many generations, but came both before and during the era of exclusion by all kinds of routes. You mention in that passage your forebear who was a railroad worker, but you had others who came by other means. And I wonder if you can give us a bit of a flavor of some of the ways that the men in your family, who were typically the ones who came first, found their way to this country, what brought them, and how they made it through.
Sure. So I found myself quite fascinated by these family stories of how we came over. Of course, the first person in our family who came over was the railroad builder. And he was actually, that was the story that really sparked my imagination. And where that moment that I described about reading the history book and not seeing any of our faces in the official photograph, I think was the moment in which I decided that these stories needed to be told and that I should write them down, right? And so, okay, I'll talk about my grandfather in a moment. But so the railroad builder was already here. Chinese exclusion didn't exist then. Oh, we should talk about what Chinese exclusion is, just a précis. Many of you, I'm sure, already know what it is, but in just a short description, Chinese exclusion was our country's first major immigration restrictions. It was the first time the border effectively shut down against any nationality. It started in 1882, and it lasted until World War II, when our country needed an ally in China against Japan. And so one of the things that it did was it halted our legal immigration into this country and blocked a pathway towards our citizenship for over 60 years. It also set the tone for future immigration restrictions going forward against other nationalities. And so one of the things I became really fascinated by really were these stories of when you have a legislation that is so discriminatory and so restrictive, how do people find a way to get in, because people need to find a way to get in, right? There were wars, famines, drought, and there were reasons why Chinese people needed to come over in the 19th century, and no other nationality had to justify really why they were coming over, right? And so I was really interested in like what were the various ways in which people came over, and one of the stories I had always heard was that my great-grandmother, who was born and raised in Hong Kong, she was literate because she was a nurse that was trained under the London Missionary Society, right? She had a baby daughter with her. Her husband, my great-grandfather, was a merchant and had papers and had been living in the United States for at least 10 years before he met his wife and brought her over. He had come over as a student. But because of the Chinese Exclusion Act laws, it was really incredibly difficult to bring her over. She had a 10-month-old baby. They did not want her to get stuck in any of the detention centers. There was also this, unfortunately for them, this incredible historic event, the Elsie Siegel murders, came up at the same time when she was trying to cross over, and the family had to make a decision. How were they going to get great-grandmother through? And the story that I had always heard was that she came over through Canada because it was easier for her as a Hong Konger to go through Canada to come in, right? I never thought to ask my grandmother, why was it that, this well-heeled, Victorian Hong Konger, why did she have to sneak across the border, right? And so what happened is, in terms of all of these questions that I was asking my family members as a child, every road ended up leading me to the Chinese Exclusion Act and a single tenement apartment building, a 6th-floor apartment building in the heart of New York's Chinatown on Mott Street, where my family members became upstairs, downstairs neighbors from each other. More on that in a minute. Then there were other illegal border crossings that happened with my great-grandfather coming across in the middle of the night. I should also say another thing was that one of the things I was very, very conscious of when I was working on this book was the ways in which I was spilling the secrets, these long-held secrets that my family members had had, and other folks like us had as well, right? And there was this feeling of kind of guilt about airing these secrets. Also, I do have an awareness of the fact that outside of our community, there might be people who are thinking, oh, this reinforces a stereotype of, Chinese engaging in these, from early part of the 20th century, sneaking across the border or being suspicious and all of that. I was very cognizant of these thoughts and these feelings and these criticisms, very hyper aware of them, until I found my Chin grandfather's oral history at the Museum of Chinese in the Americas. And in it, he doesn't explicitly say Chinese exclusion, but what he did say was this, that if they hadn't made the laws that way, Chinese people wouldn't have had to lie. But they made the laws the way they did, and so we had to lie.
So your family members in different times and places make their way to this country. And for many of them, there's almost a second migration of sorts from the West Coast to the East Coast. They end up, as you say, in this building in Chinatown on Mott Street. Can you give us a little bit of a flavor of the kind of world that they found there at the turn of the 20th century? Tell us, who made the building? What was it like? What made it Chinatown?
Sure. So the earliest family members actually came over in the 1880s and 1890s. And the neighborhood that they discovered then was a multi-ethnic, multilingual neighborhood of Irish and Italians and Jews from the Lower East Side, and quite a fair number of Chinese coming through. There are newspaper articles that I found, headlines that were like, is this a Chinese exodus, right? I should preclude this by saying that the earliest roots of the anti-Asian violence that we see today really go back to the 19th century that helped to create the Chinese Exclusion Act in the first place. And so in this period of time in the 1880s, into 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, Chinese people on the West Coast were effectively pushed out of their homes. You can think of them as like Chinese pogroms, right? There were these white riots pushing Chinese people out. And so I had family members who encountered this violence, and people had to make a decision. Were they gonna go hightail it back to San Francisco, right? And then maybe go back home to China? Or were they gonna be intrepid and jump upon that railroad that my ancestors helped build, make their way in a reverse migration across the country, and land in New York's Chinatown? And 3/4 of them, of my family, did end up doing that, right? Which is how they wind up as upstairs, downstairs neighbors from each other. There's a part of your question that I haven't answered.
Well, how does it become Chinatown?
Yes, okay. So there is this influx of basically Chinese from the West Coast who are refugees from out west making their way into New York City, right? And they're, one side of my family were like these, I often think of them as being kind of squeaky clean and really kind of boring. They were like these Christian do-gooders, and they went out, like they saw the ways in which, a lot of Chinese men at the time, they were separated from their wives and children because of the Exclusion Acts made it so difficult to bring the families over. When you go to Chinatown in that period, it was all men, right? And what are they doing? A lot of them are gambling. So the Christian side of my family decides to take it upon themselves and try to root out the gambling vice in Chinatown. And so they go about doing that, but they also find a way of networking with other Christian missionaries who were trying to gain a foothold in the Chinese quarters, right, to proselytize, right? And by the way, this is the side of my family I think that actually does the best economically because they have English language skills. One uncle ended up really learning English by reading the Bible, right? And my other side of my family, who were exactly the opposite. They were the earliest heads of the Chinese Tong, which when I was growing up was referred to as the Chinese Mafia. We don't say that anymore, but in the 70s we did, right? And so the neighborhood that they find is this multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilingual neighborhood, but they all wind up on Mott Street. And there's a period in time in which the building that I talk about, where we both end up living, both sides of the family end up living, was owned by an Irish undertaker, a funeral home director, right? When his building burns down to the ground, he built up this 6-story tenement apartment. And the first time I ever realized that we had roots in that building was the very first time I met my father when I was 27 years old, right in the middle of Chinatown, down on Pell Street. My father I still had an office there. He was a lawyer. And we were, by the way, I should also say that one of the driving forces in this book, my questions, my yearning to understand my family was largely because I was raised by a single mother and estranged from my father's side of the family, right? And so I always grew up wondering who this man was, who this family was. Why did my family who raised me only ever speak about this family in whispers? And were they really big wigs in Chinatown, right? So when I finally meet my father, we're walking down Pell Street and he's pointing out, he says, see that store over there? That's where our first Chin store was, and then we turned it into the Sugar Bowl, Chinatown's first coffee shop. And you see that place over there? When I was growing up, that used to be an opium den. And then he pointed straight up the block to a 6-story red brick edifice and said, that building over there, if you look at that window, That's where my grandparents, your great-grandparents lived. And you see that window over there? That's where I was born, where your grandparents lived. Not 2 or 3 months later, I was talking to the grandmother who raised me. And I was asking her about how she grew up in Chinatown. She also was born in her building. And then I discovered she told me the address. And the address was the exact same building that my father was born in, that 6-story red brick building on Mott Street in the heart of the community. And it was only later, after interviewing other family members, that I realized that they were indeed upstairs, downstairs neighbors from each other. The families went to the same churches, went to the same schools, regular school and Chinese school, summer together on the Jersey Shore. There's a Chinese enclave out in Bradley Beach, New Jersey, right? By the time I was born, the families hated each other. Nobody had a nice word to say about one another, right? But generations before, they were all neighbors and friends and colleagues, right? Living in the same building and living under the same weight and scrutiny of the Chinese Exclusion Act laws.
You've alluded just now in this fascinating answer to a couple of the institutions that made the community in various ways, the churches and the tongs, and of course community associations that own the building on Mott Street too, right? But one of the things that's really striking in any diasporic community, and certainly the one that you write about, are the many ways in which people from quite different backgrounds are thrown together, as much as upstairs, downstairs neighbors in the same building, and kind of have to find affinities because of where they are that they wouldn't have found otherwise. And this comes through really clearly in the case of a couple of your, I hope I'm getting the generations right, great-grandmothers.
Yes, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that sort of distinction and how these two women were different and yet similar?
Sure. So from the outside of the community, people I have an aunt who was a white woman who married into the family in the early part of the 20th century. She and others like her would have seen, Chinese families living together in the same building. But it turns out that my one of my great-grandmothers on my side, the one who was the nurse from Hong Kong, she actually was Hakka, right? She was from a different ethnicity, right? Still Chinese, but families that had moved from the south and settled down in the Guangdong region and in Fujian. But also, these were the earliest Hong Kongers, right? She did not have bound feet, right? Because Hakka did not believe in that. She was tenacious. She was literate at a time in which, in 1907, how many women are actually literate at that time, right? But she needed to know how to write both in English as well as Chinese because she needed to, tally up all of the births in colonial Hong Kong for the colonial government. All right. And she's very Christian, right? That's the upstairs family. The downstairs family is my Chin side, right? From Toisan, right? My great-grandmother, who also did not have bound feet, was a daughter who basically was not going, the family did not think she was going to marry well, right? Because she didn't have bound feet. But she was also a tenacious survivor. The daughter of a fishmonger who marries the third son in the Chin family, who becomes head of the Onlong Tong, right? These two women are upstairs, downstairs neighbors from each other. They do not like each other. They know right away that one is very different from the other. And all the rest of the Chinese women in the building were from Toisan, right? So my Hakka great-grandmother, she is very, very distinct. She also, she doesn't speak Toisan, right? She speaks like pure Hong Kong Cantonese, which was a language my grandmother really wanted me to learn, right? So anytime I said anything that was like my grandfather's, like in his Hoisan accent, she'd be like, don't say that, you know. Those of you who are, you know, Cantonese and from Toisan know exactly what I'm talking about. So there were these distinctions between the women. And eventually, as time goes by, with the birth of many children and also the loss of children through the many decades of epidemics that happened in New York City at the turn of the century, right? Diphtheria, the flu of 1918, right? Actually, writing about them surviving these different pandemics in early New York really gave me hope as we were dealing with our own pandemic.
You alluded in the passage that you opened this conversation with to the ways in which the family stories are actually, in many ways, the source of a kind of truth, and that it's the written record for Chinese Americans in particular that's really deceptive. Can you share with us perhaps an example or something where that really became clear to you and where you had to find your way through this thicket of archival deceptions to try to find out something about the stories that you were trying to uncover?
Yeah, so most of my family members were able to come over however they made their way through and then establish themselves as merchants here in New York City. With the exception of my grandfather, the gourmand that cooked up all those fabulous meals for the family, that was my grandfather, Gene. Gene was the grandson of the railroad builder. And if the railroad builder had been able to stay, Grandpa Gene would have been an American citizen, right, by birthright. But in fact, because the railroad builder was pushed out, my family, you know, in the 1890s, my family, that side of the family had to come in. And when they came in, it was during the height of the exclusion era. And so when my grandfather Gene comes over, it's 1938. It is the winter time, and he is Japan has invaded China, and he's fleeing the war. His family had purchased papers for him in order to come over, and he gets stuck in detention in Seattle for 3 months. He doesn't know when he's able to get out. And so I went back, and I was able to trace his National Archives file. And when I found it, I was so angry when I find this file, because by this time, exclusion is already in its 4th decade, right? Maybe 5th decade. And so it already has like a long history. And his file is the thickest file that I've encountered, right? And it's filled with pure lies, right? Or so I thought. It turns out I went back to our villages, and I presented the photograph. There was a photograph of my grandfather at 16 years old, heartbreakingly beautiful, and this man who proclaims to be his father, right? And so I was like, at first I saw this picture, I was like, how did they think that man was related to our family? And then I stared at the photograph longer and longer, and I realized, oh, actually he kind of does look like a member of the Wong family. So when I go back to our villages, I showed them the file, and they were like, oh, yeah, that was his uncle. Right? And so what it turns out to be is it's very common, right, in Chinese exclusion so what happens is, in order to get in, people pretended to be someone other than they were, right? And actually, Amy Chin could explain this even better than I did, but I'm not going to put you on the spot and make you do that. All right. And so in order to get in, people had to lie and be really creative about who they were in order to get in. And so there's a paper trail on all of my family members who came in during that period that the government kept. And so when I was growing up, though, my grandfather's, the clue to all of this was that my grandfather's mail came to a different name. And I asked my grandmother, who is that? And my grandmother was like, oh, that's Grandpa. That's just his paper name. And therein was the first clue about this whole paper system, which we euphemistically called the paper son phenomenon, right? There are paper families, people who are supposedly your mother or your father vouching for you. But in fact, sometimes it's an uncle. And it was quite common for for people to purchase papers from other people in their villages or within their own families, because when you get interrogated, you at least know your village and you at least know your family members. Unfortunately for my grandfather, who was a bit of a spoiled rich boy in China, he did not study his, he did not study up on his paper family, so he got things wrong in the file. He misnamed the name of his village, which seems incredible, right? And there was another mistake in there too, but he was somehow allowed in, and some of my friends and I think that perhaps there was a little bit of something under the table being passed over to the immigration official in order to let him in.
Well, there's a very cautionary lesson in all of this about the truth of the written document. There's also and I can see there's, by the way, lots of audience questions. If you have some, please write them on the card. We'll come to those in just a second. There's also, I just want the audience to sort of get the full extent of what exclusion meant for this country, which is captured in the story of your Aunt Elva. And that is that what's going on with exclusion doesn't only affect the Chinese men and the Chinese women who are trying to come into this country and create lives here. It affects a wider range of people as well. Can you just say something about that?
So Aunt Elva was a white woman born in New Jersey who was the daughter of a Civil War veteran who meets my uncle at church in the early part of the 20th century. And they fall in love. It's second marriages for both of them. Elva is harboring a secret, which you will have to read the book in order to find out what that is. But that secret really destroys her first marriage, right? And so when Uncle Deck and Aunt Elva come together, they're a mature couple, right? They have common ground with each other. It really is a very fascinating relationship, all right? What Aunt Elva does not realize is that in 1907, 4 years after she and Uncle Deck get married, the U.S. government passed a law that said that a woman's citizenship needed to change to be reflected to that of her husband's. So American women then all of a sudden who married German men or Italian men or whatever became German, Russian, or in the case of Aunt Elva, a Chinese. Right?
I was thinking as you were speaking about something that you say a lot, both in your speech and in the book, which is we and our.
Yes.
And I wondered how that felt to you, considering that there's a whole new set of generations of Chinese Americans who's themselves first generation or whose parents have immigrated since all of the immigration changes in the 1960s.
Yes.
And I wondered, as a last question for me, how you think that the experience, this much longer history of Chinese in America, should be understood in tandem with where we're at today.
Yeah. Thanks for that excellent question. So this story, the roots of the story, go back to a period in time in which our very young country, during the era of Reconstruction, is asking itself, who is an American and who is not? Who is one of us and who is not? And the decisions that they made back then, during the era of Reconstruction, when it was an opportunity for the country to build anew, instead became a period in time of great entrenchment, right? Southern politicians intent upon supremacy work hand in hand with anti-Chinese popular politicians from the West Coast. They work hand in hand towards passing the Chinese Exclusion Act laws and other exclusionary laws thereafter, right? And the decisions that were made back then set us as a country on a course towards viewing all Asians as being foreign and suspicious. So for the Asian Americans out there whose families came after the 1960s, after the 1965 Immigration Act, you may be asking yourself, why do people ask me all the time, where am I from? No, where am I really from? I, too, as a fifth-generation Chinese American, am constantly being asked that question. And so the answers to this question go all the way back to the 19th century. And so I believe thoroughly that the impact of exclusion is still with us today. There's one fact that I have in the book, I should paraphrase myself, which is, for the first 4 decades of exclusion, right? Exclusion happens in 1882. We look at the census data from 1880 to the 1920s, to 1920. You will see that the Chinese population in this country dipped by 25%, while at the same time, the general US population more than doubled, okay? So that is significant. The Chinese population, the Asian population that was already here dips from 1880 to 1920 by 25%, while during that same period of time, the overall US population more than doubles. That tells you everything about what they were trying to do to us during the exclusion period. And I think that as difficult as it is to stomach that this actually happened, I think it's important that we know it and that we tell people about it because we don't want it to happen again.
I'm going to switch to the questions that you have all kindly written on these cards and put them to Ava, but I'm going to just address one very quickly myself and invite you to add on, which is Chinese exclusion a uniquely American phenomenon, or did it exist in other countries with large immigrant populations, countries like Australia, Canada, and the UK? And I'll just note that Chinese exclusion was a global phenomenon in the later 19th century,
yes,
particularly profound, in fact, in Australia.
Yes.
And
yes,
that it's, there are historians who will say that the modern regime of border control was essentially created in response to Chinese migration around the world.
Or rather, restrictions against
Chinese.
Chinese.
That's what
right.
Yeah.
Well, so, this is true today, right? What happens in this country sets a standard, right? And then other countries start looking at it and saying, okay, the US is doing it. It's okay, right? They follow suit. So our exclusionary laws occurred before the Canadian laws, right? After us, Canada ends up having a head tax. They have what sounds like a kind of an innocuous law, which is called the Chinese immigration law. But they put this exorbitant head tax on every Chinese person coming through, right? And so that is prohibitive, right? Economically prohibitive. And then you, right, exactly. Australia follows suit. So what happens here is incredibly important because other countries see it as setting a standard and then they follow.
And even prior to that, restrictions on where sailors could go and things like that in the British world. So there's a lot of, there's a lot going on. And of course, in California, where it's Irish working men's associations, which are involved in some of the anti-immigrant activities. So there's a lot of, let's just say there's a lot of reasons why people today might benefit from knowing about this history.
Yes.
In our national past. So another question. Did you find any other Chin families who lived in that building who were not related to you?
Oh, I hate to say it. Most people who were Chins who were in the building were related. In fact, related to us. I've counted at least 49 family members from both sides of my family in the building. And since going on this tour, I just came back from a national book tour, and since coming back, I did along the way discover other family members who lived in the building. So it's.
You once mentioned to me that Chin, the spelling, is a giveaway for coming in a certain generation.
Yeah, that's right. So depending on how you spell Chin, which vowel you use indicates, which period in time in which you came, and by which region, right? So our Chins that are spelled with an I, we are OG Chins from the four counties, from Toisan, right? Or, from the four counties, right? And then, but if I meet somebody who spells their last name Chan, I'm like, oh, that's a Hong Konger, right? And then if we meet somebody who's Chen, that's somebody who came over, around the time that Pinyin was established. When was Pinyin established? Was it the 70s? Do you remember? Was it the 70s? Oh, and you should know that. You were always like, when it was this, I don't remember. Anyway, so I once had, I was studying Mandarin, and our Mandarin teacher looked at my name and she was like, "Oh no, Ava, your last name should be spelled Chen." And then I told her, no, our history in this country goes all the way back to the 1880s. And we spell it before the romanization, standard romanization, before Pinyin, we spell it Chin. And then she looked at me and just said, it should be spelled Chen.
Well, this feeds nicely into the next question. Any advice on how to research one's history given barriers of English written records and Chinese oral histories?
Okay, so I am a wonderful example of how an ABC Juksing can actually do research in different parts of another country, and all I can say is that you probably have more resources than you realize. Do not allow lack of literacy and language skills to prevent you from writing the story that you most need to tell. So I was very lucky. There are people in this room who helped me along the way, many people who helped me along the way, working on this book, doing the research. And then basically, so I won a Fulbright to China. We went to China, did research in China. And then I had friends who helped me when I was trying to gather the documents, like which documents I should get translated, and that kind of thing. So in this book, I used both Chinese language sources, English language sources, exclusion records, newspaper articles, mostly English language newspaper articles, but some Chinese language newspaper articles. Oh, and some Yiddish, newspapers, because there were articles, because my family ended up helping pogrom victims at the turn of the century. So it was a multilingual effort, and I engaged a lot of friends with help. So love to all of you for that.
And I imagine you would share my view that being dogged about it and going back again and again whenever you get new information with new queries is important.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. Because what happens now is actually a little crazy making because of the wonders of the internet. There was always newer and there's always more and more information coming out. So last time I went to a National Archives office, there was this guy in the corner that was being paid by Ancestry to scan all of the documents. I don't remember which documents he was scanning, but all day long, 8 hours of the day, he's just scanning these documents. So you might find that you do a search, in January, But then later in November, you should do it again right before your book is published. So because you're going to find more things. I mean, it is slightly crazy making. And you will have to make a decision of when to finally stop, right? And when to finally publish the book. But just know that it is a constant process of falling down rabbit holes.
Another question wants to know how important Christian identity was in shaping your family's culture and identity as Americans.
So I think that certainly on my maternal side and my mother's side, it was incredibly important. They were Christian in China, right? My great-grandfather wrote in his prep school application that what occupation did he want? Missionary, right? And so that side of the family really, I think, did a lot better economically than the other side of my family because there was this whole network of people there who were there to help them and to, even helping them get over, right, into the country. So they had a lot of resources. The other side of my family, the side that was more connected with the Tongs, they had their own networks, right, that were basically within the community itself. Right, and so the language skills for them, for that generation, came a lot later, right? But whereas my mother's side, they actually spoke English at home. Part of that was because they lived with Aunt Elva, and when you live with a matriarch in the family who, doesn't speak your language, you don't want to disrespect her, right? So everyone spoke English. Also, the other thing is that it was a multilingual household, right? So that even the Chinese languages, it was like, my grandmother spoke, pure Cantonese and Hakka, and my great-grandfather was speaking, Toy San, and could speak Cantonese as well. So there were lots of dialects going on in the house, but English became the lingua franca for that family, and that, I think, helped them enormously in terms of getting more of a footing in the U.S.
So there's a last question here, which I might need help from the person who wrote it in filling me in. It says, do you have a favorite something, which I can't make out, on Mott Street? Memory. Okay.
A favorite memory
yes.
on Mott
Which seems
Street.
like a great question to end this on.
Yeah. So I think probably my favorite memory is one of my favorite memories is actually at the very end of the book. So I won't talk to that because, that is a gift to you, all right? That is a gift to you. But one side of my family, actually both sides of my family had front-facing apartments, right? And the front-facing apartment in any a tenement building, that's the place where you want to be because you see the entire neighborhood from there, right? And so it really is like the mothers of Mott Street, right, are at their windows looking out. But I think that one of my favorite memories is actually a recent memory. It's a memory that we were able to make, my husband and my daughter and I were able to make together as a family, which was I have access to one of the Chin family apartments, and that faces the front. And when the Chinese New Year parade comes every year, it goes down Mott Street. And it was just a pleasure to sit outside with my daughter, Mei Mei, and look outside and see the neighborhood, which, has changed, hasn't changed since, my great-grandparents lived there. So thanks for that question.
Well, Ava, thank you for your research, for your storytelling, for sharing so much, so many ideas and so many feelings with us. Buy the book, learn more. Thank you, Ava.
Thank you. I'm gonna take a picture of you. Good. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll be out front.